Sure, Kung Fu Panda is fun, but is it worth going to the theaters for the fourth time? Stay tuned to This, That, and Theology to find out. You're watching This, That, and Theology, equipping you to see your worldview and the worldview around you. This past week, Jack Black returned as Po the Kung Fu Panda, and yeah, it's a pretty fun film. We're going to answer two questions as we look at this video. The first is it worth watching as a film? But more importantly, the second question is what worldview or messaging is being represented as we look at this movie? Because this is a movie that is geared towards children. It's geared towards kids who are going to be drawn to the fun animation style and the high action, and yes, even the butt jokes. But this is a film that you should consider taking your family to, and we'll tell you why as we go forward. First of all, if you're not familiar with Kung Fu Panda, this is a franchise that has 3 previous films and at least 1 or 2 limited edition animated series. Po the Panda goes in the very first film wanting to be part of martial arts and is marked as the next dragon warrior. And so throughout the films and the animated series, we've seen Po kind of grow into his role as the Dragon Warrior, the defender of the Valley of Peace. By the time we get to the opening scene of Kung Fu Panda 4, he has been very comfortable in that role for a long time now. In fact, in the very beginning of the film, we see 2 scenes that show he's very comfortable with that role. This is what he loves doing. He's fighting a sea monster who has been harassing one of the villages, and he opens a brand new restaurant that is all themed around the Kung Fu Panda that's being run by both his adopted father and his biological father. You can imagine his dismay when his master comes and says, "It is now time for you to move to the next stage of being the Dragon Warrior. You need to choose a successor and become the spiritual leader of our people." Now, Po has no idea how to be the spiritual leader. He's just finally figured out how to be the Dragon Warrior. And so he's not all that keen in giving up what he knows to be comfortable. So when Po ends up defending all the relics that have been collected from a thief by the name of Chen, who tells him of this great villain called the Chameleon, he jumps at the chance to have at least one more time as the Dragon Warrior fighting a foe that is putting other people at risk. This one last adventure for the Dragon Warrior before he gives up the mantle is something that he just can't resist. So even though he's told by his master that this is a bad idea, he leaves the Valley of Peace and its quaint and rural, peace, and runs off to the city of Juniper City, which is bigger and more full of sights and sounds and, yes, flavors than he could have ever imagined before. Through a series of predictable but ultimately enjoyable plot twists, Po emerges victorious against the villain, and all that was wrong is set right, and he begins his new role as the spiritual leader of the Valley of Peace, including training his successor. Now, I won't spoil any of the details of this plot beyond what you've been able to see in the trailers, because I really do think that this is a fun, enjoyable film. Jack Black is excellent as always, and the rest of the cast does a pretty good job of supporting that. It was fun recognizing some of the voices that we have seen in cinema recently show up in this film. And while there's lots of action scenes and a certain amount of cartoon violence, it's still kept pretty clean and pretty safe for the whole family. As far as content concerns in this film, again, I said this is a violent film. It's a kung fu movie for kids, but with animated animals instead. But if you have young people who are susceptible to imitating what they see on the screen, be prepared for some karate chops and some roundhouse kicks throughout your house. There's no strong language in this film other than the word but, and they use that one quite a bit. So just be aware that that word might start showing up into your kids' conversations if you're not keeping a close eye on it. There is absolutely zero sexuality in this film, which is a welcome change from many of the films that have been coming out recently. As far as religion goes, this is a martial arts film set in China, and there is a lot of kind of general Eastern mysticism that is sprinkled throughout. There's nothing specific. There's no one religion that is really brought forward. However, the seeking of inner peace is a theme that's gone throughout the entire series, and so you should be prepared for that. There's also multiple scenes where Po or Sifu are looking for answers from the universe. They're expecting that the universe will supply the answers to their own questions and difficulties. And this is accomplished through meditation, which is a practice that is common even today, that somehow by sitting and being quiet and meditating, that answers will just come to us. And this practice has actually worked itself into the church as well, so be aware that this is in this film. There's lots of magic, and of course, in a martial arts film, there's lots of spirit manipulation. thing. It's common in many martial arts to believe that you can manipulate your spiritual energy to produce fireballs or to do things that you could never do in a normal situation. It's throughout the film, and you need to be aware of it because this is, of course, not something that is necessarily true. This is an area we can talk about much further in another video, but just be aware that the common generalized spirituality that is in many martial arts films, especially ones geared towards kids, it's going to be evident. The film is absolutely positively full of good messaging. In fact, Po is even described by the filmmakers as someone who is black and white, not just because he's a panda, but because he sees everything in good and evil. In contrast, Chen, who is a gray fox, sees the world in a series of grays. And there's even a moment later on in the film where a character yells out, "Let's do the right thing for the wrong reason." So just be aware you might have to deal with some issues of situational ethics. Finally, the closing song for this film was a surprise for me. It's a remake of Britney Spears' Hit Me Baby One More Time. In the context of the film, they're talking about actually, being hit. But if your kids start singing the lyrics around the house, you may start realizing they're singing things that have nothing to do with martial arts. While it is fun to see Tenacious D, head by frontman Jack Black, singing this song, it certainly made me feel old. It is a song you may not want to be part of your kid's normal singing pattern. There's also a message that I think should be framed and put in most people's houses and definitely instilled in our kids. You don't have to feel brave to be brave. Po has to make decisions throughout the film where he doesn't feel qualified for it. He doesn't feel necessarily that he's able to do it, but he must do it because it's the right thing to do. And even acting brave when he doesn't feel brave is just a part of being the Dragon Warrior. It's also an attribute that we'd like to see in ourselves and in our kids. However, here at This, That, and Theology, we're not just looking at what makes a film good from a cinematic position. And there's a lot to be commended in this film. We're also looking at the worldview that's being communicated. What messaging is part of the film at its core? Because everything we watch does have something that it's hoping you will agree with. And being a kids' movie, they're pretty straight out forward in what it is. Poe's greatest challenge in this film is that everything that he knows is about to change. Life is going to change right before his eyes, and he's not really ready for it. He would much rather things stay exactly the way they have been. He's just finally gotten used to being the Dragon Warrior. But change is a necessary and good part of life. None of us ever go through life experiencing everything without ever changing. We can't run away from them. And that's kind of the message that is throughout the film, that change is a necessary part of life. Even though Po is afraid of it, he ultimately knows that he must accept it. And that's pretty much the message of the entire film. Even to the fact that the bad guy is someone who just changes all the time, even if it's only a surface change. As one of the characters says later on in the film, it's easier to hold on to what we know than to accept the change that's coming. Most importantly, though, there is a messaging that happens that's kind of hidden in the later part of the film. There's a moment when Po is fighting the changeling, and she talks about how changing is all that she ever does. The response to her is that the only changes you're making are on the outside. And that's the point that as you're talking with your kids, you should explore a little bit more. Because as we're looking at what the Christian faith is and what a biblical worldview of change is, it's not just an external change. It's not just changing the way we behave, but it's actually changing the way we are. One of the powerful things about the gospel is that God doesn't just change how we act or how we present ourselves, or even how we look. God changes our very nature. We live in a culture that's full of change, and many of those changes are purely external. Even down to saying how we change our identity, those changes don't change us on a core level. They may change how we appear, they may change how we feel, but they don't truly change who we are. That's something that only God can do, that only the gospel does. As you look at Paul's letters to the Ephesians and to the Colossians, you see that we have two natures, two lives, one that we had before the gospel and one after, that we are actually changed in our innermost being. The very core of who we are is changed through the cross. We were once dead, and now we're alive. We once had a nature that was predisposed to evil, to doing things that only satisfied ourselves, and now we have a nature that has been made new, that is restored, that seeks to please God. These are all changes that aren't skin deep like the chameleon, but are actually changes of who we are at the core. Change is the worldview message. That change is a normal part and a necessary part. And ultimately, as we look for change, that change comes not from accepting a new role. It doesn't come from changing the way we behave, even from going from being a villain to a hero. Change comes when God changes us in our very heart. So the question that we start with this film is, should you go see Kung Fu Panda? I think you should. It's very rare to find a film these days that's geared towards children that avoids a lot of the social messaging that you see in many films today. So it's good to support films that actually do what they're supposed to, which is to be entertaining. And yeah, there's a message in here, and it's pretty simple. But again, this is a movie for kids. This isn't going to be some great work of cinematography, but it is a film that's enjoyable, that's fun, and clean. So if you're looking to spend some time in the theater this weekend, I recommend you take your kid to see Kung Fu Panda 4. Thank you for watching This, That, and Theology. I hope this has been encouraging and helpful. If it has, make sure to let me know in the comments below. We'll see you next time right here on This, That, and Theology.
Skadoosh. Stand back. I'm gonna kick my butt.
Seven Nation Army couldn't hold me back.